1910. I've already talked to you about that, right? The Mexican Revolution. So today we pick it up with the other revolutions in Latin America. And I'm just going to give kind of an introduction to this and maybe go over the PowerPoint in more detail on Tuesday if there's time. I'll try to also upload a video of the PowerPoint. Any questions before we get started? So today we're talking about Between Revolutions. This is taken from Chapter 9 of Charles Chasteen's book, Born in Blood and Fire. As you've seen, there's a lot of blood and a lot of fire in Latin American history, and this period of time is no exception. What did we talk about last time? What do we call the last period or epic of time? Neocolonialism, which was a period from 1880 through 1930. I think we went over that and talked about the export of raw materials out of Latin America. Also, I taught, this doesn't come in this class that much, I guess it could, but I taught a U.S. Latin America relations class once, and there was a lot of gunboat diplomacy in Nicaragua, Honduras, Dominican Republic, Haiti, where U.S. military forces would show up in order to protect U.S. business interests, especially before Franklin Roosevelt became president. During Woodrow Wilson's tenure, Robert Taft, also Theodore Roosevelt with Panama Canal. We pushed our weight. We carried our big stick and we talked loudly during those years. FDR brought in the good neighbor policy and toned that down and tried to develop a better relationship with Latin Americans. And then along came World War II. And I think, as you saw in the last essay, there was a video that I put in there as a resource about Brazil and World War II. So at least in one case, Brazil was involved with us as an ally in World War II. Thank you. And so now the war is over. And this is a period where the period of neocolonialism from 1880 to 1930 comes to an end. The period of nationalism from 1930 to 1945 was a period of growing resentment and assertiveness on the part of Latin American countries, asserting their sovereignty, asserting their national prerogatives. Cuba not least of all, because there was some degree of resentment in Cuba against the United States over the Platt Amendment, which would have been forcibly inserted into the Cuban Constitution in 1902, which basically it gave the United States the right to intervene anytime it wanted into Cuban affairs. So many Cubans, not all, but many Cubans felt resentful that the United States cut off their opportunity to become a sovereign, independent nation in the Spanish-American War, the Platt Amendment, and there had been an uprising and revolution in 1933 of university students and army sergeants against the elites of Cuba and the dictator Machado. That was the first Cuban Revolution. Remember who the army sergeant was who was leading the military side of that? A young mestizo man by the name of Fulgencio Batista. And Carlos, oh man, I'm terrible with names when I don't have them in front of me. Carlos Socorás was one of the university student leaders and later became president of Cuba in the late 1940s, early 50s. So there was this nationalist surge in Cuba, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Argentina, of these countries wanting the United States to leave them alone and let them be, Nicaragua, leave them alone and respect their national sovereignty. And you see it in the arts, in the literature, in the poetry of that time period, the music. This nationalism was insurgent. And now that brings us to 1946 in the post-war, after World War II, and Juan Perón is elected president of Argentina. There's a uprising in Bolivia, and there's actually a revolution in Bolivia that you probably never heard of. One of the reasons why you've never heard of it is because the United States left them alone. The MNR is the name of the Movimiento Nacional Revolucionario in Bolivia. And they instituted some revolutionary policies. And the United States took a look at it and thought, well, they're all the way down there in South America. They're far away from us. They really can't hurt us. Let's just, be nice, leave them alone, send them recognize their government. And it worked. Surprisingly, the Bolivian Revolution cooled its fervor, became more moderate, and there was no fuss, no problem. Got along with the United States without the United States sending troops or intervening. Unfortunately, the United States didn't do that with other countries closer to our borders, such as Cuba in 1959 and Guatemala in 1953. Did I talk to you about 3 ways to evaluate a revolution? There are revolutions and there's revolutions. Not all revolutions are the same. The American Revolution of 1776 is not the same as the Haitian Revolution in 1790, just a few years later. You can evaluate a revolution based on how it deals with politics, how does it deal with economics, and how does it deal with society. And for example, in the Mexican Revolution of 1910, it did affect the economy. A whole new class of people came to the top. Mexico became more nationalist and more protective of its mineral rights, like oil beneath the surface. They nationalized oil companies, foreign oil companies, like from the Great Britain or the United States, which didn't make the United States very happy. So they became much more protective of their raw materials, and a different class of people came to power, as did in the French Revolution. In society, the white Creole Mexicans were kind of displaced, and mestizo Mexicans came to the forefront in the Revolution. So you have political, you have economic and social. In the Haitian Revolution, you have political. The white slave owners, French slave owners, were thrown out or killed. And Toussaint Louverture, with his slave army, eventually took power. In terms of society, you now have blacks in control of Haiti instead of white French. In terms of economy, the slave economy came to a stop. And of course, that created problems for Haiti to figure out alternatives. And so it was a pretty radical revolution. The U.S. Revolution, or the American Revolution, did it change politics? Yes, it changed politics because it went from a monarchy to a republic. Did it change the economy? No. The same people that had money before the American Revolution had money after the Revolution. Thomas Jefferson was wealthy before and after. Did it change society? Not really. And so the American Revolution hits 1 out of the 3, and that's the political. Haitian Revolution hit 3 out of 3. And so that's one way you can look at a revolution and evaluate how intense or deep or radical the revolution is. And I'm not saying that all revolutions are good, that they don't have terrible or negative consequences. Sometimes not having a revolution also has terrible and negative consequences, such as what would have Saint-Domingue have been like without the Haitian Revolution. That kind of abuse of human beings would have continued. So that brings us up to 1954. Jacobo Arbenz is president of Guatemala. I can't remember the name of the president before him. This is what happens when I try to do this without notes. The president before him was the first democratically elected president of Guatemala. Let that sink in for a moment. 1952 or 51, Guatemala democratically elected a president. That's a huge step forward for Guatemala. He carried out his term with some mild reforms, and then he made sure there was a peaceful transfer of power to a successor, Jacobo Arbenz, who I think was a college professor, or maybe the first one was. And then he stepped down. Again, that's pretty huge in Latin America. Generally, the pattern is people don't want to step down. They want to hold on to power as long as possible. So Jacobo Arbenz becomes president of Guatemala, the second democratically elected president. And he decides on an ambitious plan of reform. And this is almost always where revolutions get into trouble, if they push a little too hard, too fast. Salvador Allende in Chile in 1972, we'll get up there. That's actually after this time period, but we'll get there. He was a socialist elected president of Chile, democratically elected, but only with a plurality. That means there were 3 people running, and he got less than 50% of the vote, but he won. But then he started to nationalize the banking system and nationalize the mines, and he pushed pretty hard, pretty fast, and they took him out. There was a coup.
I don't know. I think it is interesting because everybody's trying to play the game, but they didn't want to play in the game is to get out.
It's because if you're trying to change the system, you're coming up against invested interests of people who have an investment in the system as it is. And even if you're doing it legally, change comes slowly. And if you push too hard, too fast, you're going to generate a action-reaction. And so that's what happened with Salvador Allende. It's also what happened with Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. He decided one of his signature programs would be land redistribution. So he wanted to give inexpensive land, small plots for subsistence farming to peasants, which peasants in this time period means descendants of indigenous people, descendants of the Mayan Indians in Guatemala. And so he wants to make sure they have land they can grow their food on. And where's he going to get that land? I mean, there are wealthy Guatemalans who own a lot of the land. But as he looks around, he sees that the United Fruit Company is growing a bunch of bananas in Guatemala. But they also bought as much land as they're using to grow bananas. They have that much more land in reserve in case the original land gets depleted and they need more land. So they're not using it. Nothing's growing on it. And they had the United Fruit Company reported the value of the land to the Guatemalan government for tax purposes. Of course, they reported it very low because they didn't want to pay a lot of tax. And so they were paying taxes on a very low value of this immense amount. I don't know how much it was, maybe several million acres of land that the United Fruit Company owed. So Jacobo Arbenz said, okay, we want that land. Not the land you're cultivating, the land that's lying unused. We will pay you for it. We're not going to take it from you. We're going to pay you. We'll pay you what you reported on your taxes. They underreported. So that was much less than the land was really worth. And so they didn't want to do that. They wanted to jack the price up. And in fact, they didn't want to give up the land. So he's the president of Guatemala, so he's going to take the land and pay and compensate the owners, the United Fruit Company. So the United Fruit Company, the board of directors, have close ties with John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, and Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA. they both had at one time or another had been on the board of directors for the Banana Fruit Company. I keep saying banana, the United Fruit Company. This makes me bananas. Thank you, Chuckles. I'm a frustrated comic. Only really funny when I'm not trying. It's accidental. So, United Fruit Company calls their buddies in Washington, the Secretary of State, and the director of the CIA, and says, hey, we have a problem here. So they authorize an operation. They find a disaffected Guatemalan colonel with authoritarian tendencies, Artemas Castillo, and they offer to make him the puppet leader of Guatemala if he would agree to certain things, to agree to leave the United Fruit Company alone, for example. And so the United Fruit Company agrees. He agrees. Artemas Castillo. They set up a training camp I think, in Honduras, where they're training a handful of Guatemalan mercenaries, something like 1,500. And they go on the radio and say that Jacobo Artemas is involved with the Soviet Union, and he is buying weapons from Czechoslovakia, and it's a communist coup in Guatemala, and they're going to invade Guatemala and take it back for freedom and democracy. But actually, it's just the opposite. That's just like 1984, Animal Farm, all that stuff where you make up words and you make them mean the opposite of what the truth is. You can tell I have some feelings about this. I'm sorry. You can't always be completely dispassionate about history. And it's everywhere. And if you read any books, if you go to Wikipedia, if you go to ChatGPT, you'll find information on this subject. So the little ragtag army of Castillo Artemas's mercenary followers crossed the border into Guatemala. The Guatemalan army could have easily defeated them, but they were also not happy with the current president, Jacobo Arbenz. Jacobo Arbenz. And some of the wealthy landowners in Guatemala weren't happy with him and his reforms. So there's a weak response. So they allow them to come into the country. They go on the radio. They announce that he's invading Guatemala to put down a communist coup led by Jacobo Arbenz. And the CIA flies overhead with American-financed airplanes and bombs, does some bombing, and Jacobo Arbenz decides to avoid bloodshed to leave the country. And Castillo Artemas becomes the new president of Guatemala, basically a dictator.
You know where he resided?
No, I don't. I might have known it at one time, but it's in my notes somewhere if I do. But he leaves the country. And so that brings an end to 2 democratically elected presidencies in Guatemala. Because of the way this happened and the fact that it was anti-democratic, what you get is a lot of frustrated workers and indigenous people rise up and start to fight the government over a 40-year period. One of the longest civil wars in all of Latin America happened in Guatemala after this moment. You have Mayan Indians armed and fighting against the government for the next 40, 50 years. 200,000 people died. It was, in many ways, in the 1990s, it was considered to be a genocide against the Mayan people. All of this bloodshed, because the United Fruit Company, I'm oversimplifying. It's never this simple in history, but I am going to oversimplify to make a point. All of this bloodshed over a 40 or 50-year period, and a lot of people leaving, a lot of Guatemalans leaving and traveling north through Mexico to try to get to the United States because of the violence. All of this because the United Fruit Company didn't want to give up its reserve land that was not being used. And our CIA was complicit in this process. So this is one event in the middle of this time period called Between Revolutions, which shows you part of the reason why there was a sentiment in favor of revolution. And nationalism was very much a part of this. And yes?
Over here in the U.S., does it exist like a law, like social purpose for land? Because at least in Brazil, you can have like an apartment with nobody in for like 20 years. It's like your property needs to have social use. Does it have over
I don't
here?
think we have a law like that. I'm not aware of any.
That would be interesting and a little bit hypocritical, right? And then it doesn't have use at all. People who are
Yeah, I don't think there's a law like that. So anyway, this is what happened in Guatemala. This was under Eisenhower, which makes me sad because he was one of my favorite characters in history in his role in the World War II, and I think generally he was a pretty good president. But he allowed the CIA and the Dulles, John Foster, the Dulles brothers, to talk him into a couple of these things of regime change, overthrowing governments. And I think in Guatemala it was clearly a mistake. The next year, or maybe it was the previous year, they did this. The U.S. did the same thing in Iran when they overthrew. I can't remember his name. Mohadin. I can't remember. I can't pronounce it. But there was a democratically elected president of Iran, and the Great Britain and the United States colluded to get rid of him and put in the Shah of Iran as his replacement, which led in a direct line to our problems today with Iran and the Revolutionary Republic of Iran, because up until 1954, Iranians pretty much loved the United States and loved our moral example and democracy. But after that underhanded play, we lost any credibility we ever had with the Iranian people. And so there's two within a year of each other, where the CIA was allowed to bring about regime change, creating a lot of backlash and hostility to the United States. So, any other comments or questions on this? Yes.
that happened in a whole lot of America, right? Like, from 1964 on, like all the